Welcome, everybody. We have a good contingent in person and a really healthy contingent online for this session. I'm Mark Bragdon, the librarian head for the Harriet Irving Library Research Commons. Happy to introduce our second booster session of the semester featuring Catherine Gracey and Aaron Grubb. It's entitled AI in the Classroom and the Workplace, Boosting Your Productivity. Kat is our librarian working in open scholarship and also has responsibilities with the Faculty of Computer Science, the Technology Management and Entrepreneurship Group, among others. And Aaron is a tech professional with Minebright using AI applications in the workplace. So I'll leave it to you.
Hello, everyone. So thank you for that introduction, Mark. Today, we're going to start out by, I will talk a little bit about how AI integrates into search, some of the primary use cases for generative AI and search, and some of the considerations for use as well. And then we'll hear from Aaron, who's going to talk about his experience using generative AI at work and some of the limitations and important skills for students and kind of emerging professionals. So I just want to kind of start with a bit of context that information seeking is an actually really ancient process. We a lot of the time think about this in a context just of academia, but information seeking is all around us. We're doing it all the time, whether it's in an academic context or not. And we all develop skills in information seeking based on the society and context in which we live. In our lifetimes alone, these skills have shifted massively. In most of the 20th century, if you wanted to find information and you didn't have a massive collection of encyclopedias at your home, you would have had to physically go into the library, use a card catalog to locate the location of the resource in the library, and then actually go and look through the resource to find the information that you needed. Increasingly, the world has become more digitized, so that allowed things like search engines and databases to operate in which you could search keywords or controlled vocabulary. You can see here, this is an example of quite an extensive systematic review search where they've specified lots of different terms that they're looking for. But if you're not familiar with this kind of methodology, what they're doing here is they're literally searching for these words to appear somewhere in the title or abstract, or they're looking for the system to have tagged, or the database or human kind of cataloger to have tagged the resources with these labels, essentially. So this obviously requires a lot of skills in kind of really obvious ways where you have to understand how the system works.
But we increasingly work in this really frictionless world where we can find information without necessarily having to engage super thoughtfully. So if you have a favorite sports team, you might be doing this a lot. If you're watching the Blue Jays right now, you might be constantly kind of updating search results. For instance, if I want to search Habs game, now thanks to AI, Google understands that I'm actually talking most likely about the Montreal Canadiens hockey team. I don't actually have to literally type in Montreal Canadiens. I don't have to worry about spelling errors. And thanks to things like natural language processing, it'll return this, which is in this case what I'm looking for. So it's really great. So AI is actually not super new to search. If we think about search engines, again, they use natural language processing. This is not super new. Machine learning was also used to rank relevancy, so that it would return things that other people clicked on a lot. So AI itself isn't super new in the search space. But generative AI is really disruptive in lots of ways in that it's not just returning results that it perceives to be relevant to you, it's actually also generating new content. So I want to kind of specify that for most of this presentation, both Aaron and I are going to be focusing in more about generative AI because, again, AI itself is not necessarily a super new technology. So I'm going to focus on kind of three primary use cases for generative AI in search and talk about some of the resources we have here at UNB Libraries that can potentially support you in this process. So first of all is discovery, and this is probably what you think of when you think of library. It's finding resources initially. So actually looking for texts or resources that might be relevant to your research question or your query. So you can think about this. Other ways of doing this would be things like going and looking at a shelf that contains a certain topic in a library and kind of looking through what might be relevant to you, or things like a database search or a search engine type of search. And initially, when ChatGPT, that's one I'm going to talk about a lot because it was really important, like historically in the context of generative AI and search, when ChatGPT came out and other LLMs that were kind of primarily chatbots came out, these were not actually really designed as search tools, in particular not academic search. So historically, like in 2023 when this first came out, they were not generating output data or output based on external search results. They were doing it on their training data alone, which is why you saw results that would say things like, unfortunately, we're not able to answer things past January 2022 because there was no live search happening. And so things were generated, outputs were generated by predicting which word would come next, and hallucinations were very likely. And I'm going to just briefly talk about different types of hallucinations and how we're kind of trying to work around hallucinations now. So the first thing that's problematic is for the librarian colleagues in the room, we had a number of situations where students would come to us and they'd say, I have a reference list or this article looks really relevant to me, but I can't find it. Can you help me find it? And we would come to realize that it was actually a hallucinated reference because generative AI will just kind of put together a prediction of words that sounds like a logical kind of article. So fake sources is obviously really problematic for students or for anyone looking for information that they want to go explore further. So this is an example from, again, around 2023, early 2024, where I asked ChatGPT to write me a list of peer-reviewed articles, and it gives me one that looks really real, challenges facing Canada's healthcare system in the 21st century. It's saying it was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. It's a real journal. Unfortunately, this was totally hallucinated because it just strung together kind of an example article that would make sense for my query. The second is incorrect facts. So generative AI tools just generating an answer based on the training data, but it's not actually correct or tied to reality. So a good example of this is the classic how many R's are there in strawberry question, where generative AI tools would sometimes answer this wrong. It's not necessarily super clear why they're doing this, but it's just telling you something that's factually untrue. And the third is unfaithful citations. So this is when a generative AI tool pulls from a real article or a real kind of external source, but it just misrepresents what the source is saying. So it's just a disconnection from what is actually true of what's being said in the source and the generated summary. And retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, highly reduces or kind of prevents to a large scale the first two types of hallucinations. So what it's doing is supplementing LLMs with an external search and returning results that contain kind of similar words or perceived things that are perceived to be relevant. And the great thing here is that outputs can be traced to specific sources. So you're not going to have generative AI tools, and we'll talk about an example of these in a second, that are going to make up citations because they have the ability to pull from real citations. But what can happen is they can still misrepresent the content that is being portrayed in the articles or the resources that they pull. So this is really great because it's going to reduce the number of hallucinations, but it's important to remember that not all retrieval augmented generation tools are created equally, especially in the context of academic search. So it's essential to look at the corpus or the library that they're actually searching. So for instance, if you use something like Perplexity AI, it's going to search a more broad kind of internet search, not necessarily just scholarly articles. There are, I'll talk about it in a second, there are academic versions of lots of tools, but a lot of the time the default will not be to search an academic source. So it's an important thing to look for. So this is one example of someone who went and did a just kind of general Perplexity survey, and they pulled which sources were linked to the most, and you see things like Reddit and YouTube being at the top. So this is not inherently problematic if you're looking for a recipe for dinner, or you're looking for grocery list ideas or interior design advice, but it might be problematic if you're trying to write an academic article or learn really deeply about a topic. So this is something you want to consider. What is the source that's actually being searched? And there are purpose-built tools that are being designed for this. And so the difference here, they're not doing anything super revolutionary. It's that they are searching a more curated corpus that's only going to contain a kind of curated selection of works, theoretically, that are only scholarly or peer-reviewed. So there are generalized tools like Perplexity that have an academic version that offer options to this as well. But I just briefly want to talk about Scopus AI, which is an academic example that we subscribe to here at UNB Libraries. So I've put in a natural language query, which is another difference. You don't have to use a keyword search. I've done a natural language query, and it's given me this brief summary, and then the references are linked to right there. So it's really tied to the works, the original works, and it is only going to be searching within the Scopus library. So it's a smaller, more curated collection again. The only type of hallucination that's likely to happen here is that it might say, source 1 uses this methodology to apply this, and that might not actually be true, but it's not going to make up a source for you. So that's the difference here, and they're kind of working on minimizing hallucinations. And this is something that we subscribe to here at UNB Libraries, so students, staff, and faculty do have access to Scopus AI. And I'll share these slides after for Mark to disseminate with links to these things as well. Artificial intelligence can also be really helpful for expansion. So this is kind of the process of branching out to gather more information on a particular topic. Other kind of methods of doing this, if you know an author is really authoritative on a subject in history, going and reading their other works in that area, or reading analyses of authors' works. If you're doing an English report, you might want to read someone's analysis of a Charles Dickens piece that was written. Or kind of more modern, other technological things, clicking on related suggestions in a database or citation chasing. So if you read an article that looks really relevant to you, looking at the references or the citing articles of these. So these are all kind of examples of branching out, expanding. And literature mapping can be a really helpful kind of element in getting more information that's going to be relevant to you. So I have a screenshot here from Research Rabbit. And what Research Rabbit does is if you have a collection of papers, so let's say I have all of these blue papers in a library, in a Zotero library, I can upload them into Research Rabbit, and it'll give me this map with these green articles that are also highlighted, which are connected to those articles in like a citation relationship or just in terms of kind of topics and relevance. So this can help you really round out any gaps that you have in your research and is less time intensive than actually going through and reading each citation list. So this can be really helpful. And again, this isn't actually generative AI. It's more based on a lot of the machine learning and NLP, natural language processing elements of generative AI. So it's an extension of citation searching. And this is an open source tool, so it's not something that we necessarily subscribe to here at UNB Libraries, but it is free for for anyone. There are similar tools that are oftentimes more well marketed because they're not free, called Connected Papers and Lit Maps, that students ask about a lot, but Research Rabbit is going to be a really comparable tool that is free. So it's the one I generally will point people to. Finally, extraction. This one is oftentimes the kind of last thing that people think about, but it can actually be related to information seeking. So again, really basically, if you think about extracting relevant information, looking for relevant information, actually reading a document and deciding what's important for your question is like the kind of most traditional way of doing this in an academic context. I also think about this kind of as a control F if you're looking for an author's specific take on a part within a 30-page document. I might look for that subheading and kind of go there. If I want to look at the methods section specifically, I might skip to that. And there are AI tools that are able to do this, and we'll talk about some considerations in a second. But JSTOR has an AI tool that is meant to kind of be a bit of a reading assistant. So this is not a great query, ignore that, but it's the default query. So if you go into JSTOR and you go into the AI mode, each document will have kind of an ability to interact with said document. So this is the default. I searched Catherine of Aragon, and so when I clicked onto the AI tool, it says, how is Catherine of Aragon related to this text? The text is entirely about Catherine of Aragon, so that's not necessarily a super helpful question, but that's the default. And then as you go, you can continue to ask questions. So you might say something like, how did religion play into Catherine of Aragon's life? And it'll do some extracting here. And again, the thing that's nice about this is it's going to tie it to specific pages. So you then can actually go read page 166 for yourself. Make sure that there hasn't been some kind of massive mistake there or anything along those lines. Do the verification step, but it is theoretically going to save you a bit of time if you don't want to dig through a pile of work. I do want to mention here, copyright is a bit of a sticky point, just in that this is still a really gray area that we're kind of working out. So I don't want to advocate for you to go upload documents willy-nilly to generative AI applications, because it's kind of, again, a bit of a gray zone. We're still figuring out what that's going to look like long term. Is uploading something to a generative AI tool copyright infringement? It could be, potentially. I'm not saying that anyone's going to come after anyone personally and sue you, but it's just kind of a best practice in respecting the authors as well. So it's best to use tools within these databases that are purpose-driven for this, and also have the required permissions from authors to go ahead and do this. Because again, if it's held within a publisher's kind of held within a database, theoretically, the permissions are all there for that to be able to be done fairly and ethically. Some additional considerations. Aaron's going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, but in the context of learning, it's important to avoid too much cognitive offloading. So I'm not advocating for you just not reading papers anymore and just going in and trying to find all the key points and being done. This can be really helpful, again, if you have a bunch to read and you're trying to synthesize information or pull it together, but it can't replace the just cognitive benefits of actually going through and reading a paper and really engaging on a deeper level. Also consider the loss of serendipity and context. Oftentimes, if an author makes a point on page 166, pages 1 through 165 had important context there that helped build to that point. So we don't necessarily just want to jump to the answer without thinking about the additional information that might be there. And when I say serendipity, I mean sometimes as you're reading something and you're looking for X, you might actually stumble upon Y, which is really important in a way that you didn't expect or you weren't looking for, but does actually make your life easier or make your understanding of the concept more in depth. So again, these are kind of arguments for still using the non-AI kind of tools that you have available to you. Also consider the impact that bias and hallucinations could have. Again, if you're writing your thesis, you really want to make sure that there is factual basis in what you're saying. So always verify verify the claims that have come out of generative AI, and really think about like what value you're getting from an activity. So if you are studying for a test or something along those lines, you want to make sure you're actually able to retain information. So if you're just able to extract it all and don't necessarily memorize it yourself, it might not be adding a ton of value in that context for learning. So really think about what it is you're trying to get out of the activity and how to structure the activity so that you get something out of it. Because again, in the process of learning, we need to all be kind of struggling with things and really sitting with things and not just jumping right to the answers in all cases. So now I'm going to hand it over to Aaron.
Okay, my name is Aaron, and so I am a software developer for a small company / startup called Minebright, and I've been working there for about 2 years now. And I'm just going to talk about how we use AI for our work. And so here's my LinkedIn profile picture, which I should probably update at some point. But yeah, a little bit about me. I graduated from the University of Guelph in 2022 with a computer science degree. When I was doing that degree, I always thought I was more focused on like the math side of it. I found that more fun, or maybe I was just a bit naturally better at it than the software development, I thought. And so it led me to do some research with a professor to come up with did not mean to click that. Well, this is the paper. very niche that no one probably knows what it's about. But yeah, pivot gray codes for the spanning trees of a graph. So just a very niche math side of computer science before branching a bit more into software development. And so yeah, I started out just freelance web design. I was creating a project for some connections that my professor had. And then I moved into a job as more of a full stack developer with Minebright in 2023. And yeah, I just work remotely. And so most of what I'll be talking about is just going to be guided by Catherine's questions. So the first question, how was I introduced to generative AI? Honestly, I don't even really remember like the first interaction. It kind of seems like it's blended pretty naturally into the everyday life. I think the first thing I remember asking ChatGPT is I was showing my dad about this cool new tool, and he was answering some niche home renovation question, and he was kind of impressed with the result. But for work, it was with GitHub Copilot, and so that was it would basically only autocomplete the singular line of code you were on, and so we've come a long way from then. But that's the first interaction I had with it. And yeah, I feel honestly somewhat lucky in a sense to have graduated pre-generative AI. I feel like it helped, I guess not. It's a tool I kind of wish I'm glad I didn't necessarily have when I was going through school, because it allowed me to struggle through some problems more naturally, where if I copy pasted most of my questions or assignments from first few years of my degree, it would have been able to spit out the answer pretty easily, I think. So I haven't necessarily focused on learning the skills formally. It's kind of similar to, I feel like my interaction with Google growing up. I used the tool and I feel like naturally got better at it and more familiar as I was using it. Yeah, and so it's just mostly trial and error and personal experience. And so the way I use generative AI at work is kind of twofold. One for software development, generating code, but also one of our projects is building a database, just like your normal SQL database, using generative AI to extract information from press releases, technical reports that companies in the mining industry release. And so for the information extraction, there's a lot of RAG tools in there that my other coworker is a bit more focused on, but we all use a client or a code editor called Cursor for our everyday work, which has generative AI and these code completion tools within them. And so for that, I use it for basic code completion. So if I already have an idea of what I want to write, usually the AI tool can kind of guess it as well. And so it's a bit quicker, just press tab sometimes, and then it writes the code for you. Also, working in a small startup, there's lots of different areas that I interact with, front end, back end, like database, all sorts of different languages. And so some areas I'm a bit less familiar with, but I still need to try to get something to work. And so when I'm learning a new library, or I'm more experienced in front-end UI stuff, and so if I'm doing something maybe in database design, I will I'll ask generative AI to assist with that, or maybe make sure I'm on the right track. Not necessarily trusting it. And so again, we use generative AI. Every one of the 4 employees at my work use it just to help with coding. But then again, we also use it for populating a database based off of extracted information. And this extracted information is also validated, so we will, not all of it, otherwise we'd not need generative AI at all, but spot checks and yeah. And so how do I validate information from generative AI? Well, when I'm using it for convenience speed, I already have that idea in my head of, okay, this is what I am wanting to write, and before I can even type it out, it will pop up something, and so I validate with the information I already knew I was going to write. And then if I'm using it for more learning new libraries, a bit of it is intuition. So if I'm reading something and maybe it doesn't make too much sense, or I think that sounds off from my software development experience, not only in this scenario, but I will also like do some other searches myself, not just looking at generative AI. So refer to documentation. And yeah. And so this is a bit of an example from that, actually just from this other day. So this is Claude, and it says, I'm just talking about a database design type of thing. And it says suggestions for your model. And then the key piece here is it says lazy equals no load. It suggests this piece of code. And then it didn't seem very correct to me. And so I go to the documentation here, and right there it says this option is legacy. It is non-intuitive and difficult to predict results. There are no legitimate uses in the modern version of this library. And so using that bit of intuition maybe where I'm not really that familiar with the concept, it doesn't seem right, great time that I go back and refer to documentation and kind of try to back up those results myself. And in this case, yeah, it's a good thing I did. And so the benefits that I find, speed in some senses. So the autocomplete, definitely helpful. I find that when I have a problem I'm familiar with maybe, and I'm going to implement it, and even though it might seem faster if I just describe the problem myself and then try to copy paste the code, a lot of times I find that it's actually faster to try to implement it myself because it's annoying to maybe get the tool to do exactly what I want or follow the same practices that we've already implemented in our code base. So speed when it's maybe simple pieces of code to write, but when it's more fleshed out features, usually I actually find it a bit slower to implement that with generative AI. So the concerns I have about generative AI, well, the example I gave before, it telling me something confidently that doesn't actually line up with reality. Over-reliance on generative AI. You know, a lot of basic functions now, I can say, okay, what is this that, you know, most computer science majors would be able to write this for me. Maybe I'm losing something in that process. Focusing on speed over good software development practices. So it's not always, maybe in a small startup, it feels like speed is the most important thing, but sometimes it can cause problems further down the line if you're just worried about writing code fast. And then yeah, the too much trust in the outputs. I think I alluded to this a bit before, or when I first started talking. Not learning the fundamental skills. I think it's really important to struggle through those problems where, you know, you can't figure something out for hours, and you're Googling and trying to find the information yourself, and talking to other people in your program. I think it's very important to learn the fundamental skills because, as I mentioned with the intuition part, you kind of need that. I think generative AI can make you faster, but you need to know when to not trust it and dive deeper yourself. And yeah, I guess the second point also is just reiterating that. Tips I would give to students right now, I think I would suggest not using it in basically your assignments. Struggle through the problems. If you can, last resort kind of. It's great as I'm really stuck. No one else can help me maybe. Okay, let's use these tools to figure out the solution and learn that way. And then, yeah, I think maybe, again, back to just struggling through problems, it's not all about the efficiency. It's about of what you are getting out of the process, as Catherine said before as well. Why am I spending all this time doing this assignment to learn the information you need moving forward? And as I talked about before, the concerns, hallucinations, that article was a bit scary to me, is even as, like I said, even as the training models get larger, small number of documents can still poison the data. And then as the other example I gave before, the outdated information, it's not necessarily flagged. Generative AI is very confident in the outputs it gives, and you need to have your own intuition. And so, yeah, like when I'm asking questions about a library I'm familiar in, and I say that's not right, maybe I'm missing sometimes when I ask a question about a library I'm not as familiar with. So yeah. And the skills I think that is important for new grads to be learning, to be AI literate in the workplace. Honestly, I think just a strong underlying knowledge of the subject material is more important than the optimal way to use these AI tools. I think, as I said, it's a great tool for speeding up your work when you already have this knowledge, and maybe for learning new tools or new libraries. But I think you need that fundamental programming, programming skills beforehand. And yeah, I think it's kind of similar to Google. Maybe some librarians will not like me for this, but I feel like I didn't necessarily go, what are the Google skills I need to learn? I feel like I got that from interacting with the tool myself, and yeah, not taking courses or anything. So yeah, thanks for listening. Does anyone have any questions?